just want to welcome you all. My name is Tim Gill. I'm the Salt Lake County District Attorney, and it is my privilege to welcome you to the first national conference on best practices for the modern prosecutor. Before I start, I do want to acknowledge some people. All these individuals were really important in helping us get this together. Chris Haman and Marissa Demore from the Prosecutors Center for Excellence. The Conference Planning Committee and moderators, Creighton Borton, Jennifer Joyce, Mark Zahner, Susan Hunter, Denise O'Donnell, and Rich Hamp. Host of our Best Practices Committee meeting last night, Eric Zahn. Media Coordinator, Susan Ryan, Ben Haynes. And then, of course, our sponsors, Carpel Solutions, Divergent Solutions, and Advent FS. We have approximately 175 prosecutors here representing across the country. And it's going to be a fantastic group of presenters. And this project really began about 2.5 years ago with Chris and myself getting together and talking. And we said that we wanted to create a forum, an opportunity where we could come together, and our goal is to do this every couple of years, where we can start to bring in data and research, different offices with practical solutions, and the pragmatic challenges that we're facing, and how do we marry those ideas and research together for innovation and creativity to do the work that we do. And we started saying that the role has been changing. And our terrain is changing. And we really wanted to create a very pragmatic, practical conference where we will talk a wide range of issues. And if you look at your agenda, it's a wide range of issues. And all of the things that we would want to talk about, we obviously don't have the time to do, but our idea is to really do a down payment. The role of the modern prosecutor is evolving. Mass incarceration, drug addiction, use of force, homelessness, poverty, mental illness, institutional and implicit bias, wrongful convictions, bail reform, public safety, sexual violence, untested rape kits are just some of the issues that all of us in our different jurisdictions are addressing to inform the general idea of criminal justice reform. Public trust, integrity, justice, fairness, proportionality in punishment, procedural fairness are some of the expectations and promises we embrace as our duty as public prosecutors. As prosecutors, we hold a peculiar space where we advocate for our community's sense of fairness and accountability. And we also have to be good fiscal managers at the same time with scarce resources. And we are expected to be authors of innovation and creativity against a backdrop of revolving doors of the criminal justice system. We must embrace our evolving role by a commitment to our community, engaging them and informing them and respecting their desire to be involved. We're independent as elected officers. That makes us accountable directly to our community, to our process. We pursue and preserve the rights of the accused. We are compassionate advocates for victims and the communities where violence or the weight of drug addiction and mental illness overwhelms them. We are expected to lean into the controversial, embrace the difficult, because that is both our duty and our privilege. We must make our decisions no longer on gut feelings and old practices, but rather on data and research. Risk and need assessments, measurable outcomes, and methods based on best practices are becoming our norms. We are all challenged to recognize that our role is more than simply prosecuting cases, but rather our practices must impact recidivism, field diversion programs, access to treatment, the separation of violent and nonviolent offenders in our sentencing schemes, all move us forward towards the idea of reducing recidivism rates while ensuring public safety. behavioral health, cognitive therapy programs, medically assisted treatment options become a part of our vernacular and our expectations. For example, for us right now, I find myself advocating for full Medicaid expansion at 138% of the poverty level. And you might say, what does that got to do with you as a prosecutor? But when I go down to my county jail and I see that 60 to 65% of my people who are at the county jail who would benefit directly from that Medicaid expansion, it creates new options for us for the obligation that we have to serve our community to address these challenges. Treatment, re-entry, transitional housing, employment become our program and sentencing concerns. Do we support programs based on early release through treatment during incarceration? What problem-solving course do we create, implement, and sustain? Mental health course, drug course, veterans course, DUI course, family justice centers are some of the options and considerations that we have to explore. We must also seek to go out of our comfort zones and seek collaborative partnerships with policymakers, treatment providers, community partners, and they become our new conversations. If the criminal justice system is truly a system, then we can't ignore medical institution, behavioral health, community shelters, public and private partnerships, local law enforcement practices. All these become all relevant conversations and partnerships we have to explore. For example, right now, I find myself in a conversation with our partners from Habitat for Humanity and private developers, exploring the idea of transitional housing that will continue to support the trajectory of success for those coming out of addictions towards stabilized full employment. That's something that I never thought when I went to law school that it's something I would be thinking about. We must be open to innovation. Innovation in the neurobiology of trauma, trauma-informed investigations, require a paradigm shift from our traditional approaches to adult sexual assault prosecutions. To address the issue of trauma, victims of trauma from re-victimization and institutional practices that can contribute to case attrition. Untested rape kits, direct clinical support for victims of trauma call out for answers from us as leaders within the criminal justice system. Finally, how are we communicating and responding to our different communities that we serve that feel marginalized, isolated from the power that our institutions represent? These are both opportunities and challenges. In the next 2 days, we will start a conversation, share ideas that will hopefully address some of these concerns. It is our hope, Chris and myself, that this is something we will be doing every 2 years. And we will bring, hopefully, the best research, the best practices, innovations that can be shared amongst all of ourselves, with all of you who are the leaders in our community. The world is changing, and we must evolve with these new demands as we enter the 21st century. We must engage the communities we serve so we can enrich their understanding of our criminal justice system. In the end, the offices that we hold are not ours, but theirs, and we are merely temporary caretakers. In that moment, that is our privilege to hold this responsibility. Are we meeting their expectations, forwarding their ideals, delivering upon their goals about a criminal justice system that is fair, proportional, responsive, and consistent with our ideals of justice and equality? We can no longer simply go to court. Our role and responsibility is much broader. Our leadership requires creativity, accountability, courage to embrace this new evolving role. So please, share your ideas, discuss the difficult, and bring the passion, pride, and commitment that is the true hallmark of our privilege as public prosecutors. And I hope that you have a great conference. Thank you very much. So with that, we will move to our first panel. So if I can ask our first panelists to maybe join me up on the table here. So we want to start with our first panel, and we have some incredible individuals here. They represent a wide array of jurisdictions, sizes of offices, complexities of challenges, and if you will please take a second to take a look at your handout materials. There are biographical information there about all of our illustrious panelists. And if I was to take a moment to just even try to read those out, I'd be here probably for the next 45 minutes. But I want to draw your attention to that. I want to welcome with us Ms. Jackie Lacey from LA County, Ms. Beth McCann from Denver, Bill Montgomery from Maricopa County, Ms. Theo Stamas from, I forget, is it jurisdiction? Arlington, Virginia.
And the city of Falls Church.
That's right. And Cy Vance from New York. Please give them a round of applause. So I want to, first of all, thank you so much for taking the time to come here. And what we really wanted to do with this first panel was to sort of introduce the range and diversity of our different experiences. So if I may start with you, Ms. Lacey, and work our way down, can you share with the group here why you chose to be a prosecutor? What motivated you, and what keeps you still engaged in this task?
Well, thank you. I have an embarrassing answer to give why I became a prosecutor 30-something years ago. It was an act of desperation. I hated the job. My first job out of law school was at a small civil firm, and I always believed that I was going to be a trial lawyer. And in civil, in the firm that I was in, you never went to court. Everything's settled. And I remember being in a deposition, looking out the window and thinking, I am bored to death. I'm going to change professions. But I got a call that night from a law school friend who said the local prosecutor's office was hiring. And I applied, and within 2 weeks I realized this was the work I was born to do. Since then I've stayed, never gone anywhere, and much to my surprise, 30-something years later, I am the head of the office, and I really never quite imagined that. My predecessor, Steve Cooley, one day came to me and said, I'm going to retire and I think you should be the next DA. I just looked at him, I said nothing, and it took a couple of years before I really convinced myself that campaigning, that the office was worth the pain of campaigning, that it was worth it, right? And so I was elected in 2012, re-elected without opposition in 2016, and here I am.
So what keeps you coming back to that?
Oh, I love the work. I love criminal justice. The cases to me are so interesting. The issues are so interesting. And right now we're in such a period of change with regard to criminal justice reform. I sort of feel that growing up in South LA with the background that I had and the neighborhood that I had really gives me somewhat of a background to understand why we're even talking about reform, but then also dedicating my life to protecting the community by keeping it safe and holding people accountable. That's, been the second half, really, of my life. And I feel like those two experiences in my background have uniquely prepared me to lead that office at this particular time. So it's in my blood.
And also, I think you and Ms. McCann are also the first women elected district attorneys in your respective jurisdiction.
Yes, so I'm the first woman, the first African American. I will say in California, though, when I was elected in 2012, there were 48 DAs in California. At the time I was elected, there were 7. But come November, it looks like there will be 28 women elected. So we'll be the majority. And if you know anything about national politics, women make up about 23% of the elected. So California prosecutors will be a very unique group of folks.
Thank you. Ms. McCann, why did you choose to be a prosecutor? What motivated you? What keeps you still engaged?
Well, I have a more varied background, I think, than probably many of the folks up here. But I started in the Denver DA's office, actually after a year of clerking, primarily because I wanted to learn how to try cases and also had a commitment to the idea of serving the public and making sure that we maintain safety in our communities, but also looked at the criminal justice system with a little bit of a broader lens. So I was interested in not just the trial work, but also the underlying issues of safety and providing opportunities for people to change the direction of their lives and make better choices. But I was very young at that time and pretty idealistic, and so I enjoyed learning how to be in the courtroom, how to handle cases, and then I went into private practice for a while, and I enjoyed that quite a bit, but like Jackie, I found that it was not as satisfying or as fulfilling for me personally as I had found in the public service, in the public arena. And then I was fortunate enough to be appointed to, in Denver we have a position called Manager of Safety, which is a civilian head of the police, fire, and sheriff's departments. So, and that was part of the mayor's cabinet. So that was really a challenging job, as you might imagine. Did that for a while, worked in some other capacities with the city administration, and then moved over to the Attorney General's office, where I headed up our civil litigation and employment law unit and had trial attorneys in that unit, and really learned how to supervise and enjoy being around trial attorneys again. But then I kind of went another direction and ran for state legislature and was elected to be a state representative for 8 years, which we have term limits in Colorado, not just for legislators but also for district attorneys. We're one of the few states, I think, that has term limits for DAs, so our DA was term limited, and I really found a passion for looking at criminal justice, as I mentioned, in a broader lens. At this point I had a lot more experience and really was interested in this whole idea of modern prosecution and what does that mean and how do we support our young attorneys in our offices and also look at our communities. So it was a very good fit for my background to come back and be then the elected DA.
Thank you. Bill?
So I was in my second job out of the Army. I left active duty in 1995 after 6.5 years of service. I got my commission out of West Point. And in that second job, was working in Silicon Valley and really missed the camaraderie and the sense of serving something greater than yourself. And at the time, I had a couple of paths that I could have taken. My wife was taking her MBA, so I knew I didn't want to do that. I had enough of math, science, and engineering as a cadet, so I knew I didn't want to get an advanced degree in engineering. And so one day I told my wife that I was thinking about law school. She reminded me that when we met, she was an HR manager at a Palo Alto law firm, and her statement was, if I had wanted to marry a lawyer, I could have done that. So my response was, well, I don't want to be a lawyer, I want to be a prosecutor. And I don't think she believed that there was really a difference, but she encouraged me. And so in going to law school from the outset, I wanted to be a prosecutor. I wanted to serve in a position that would make a difference in the community and that would allow me to stand up for victims of crime, protect the community from those who were engaged in some of the most serious criminal activity. And at the end of each day, I wanted to have a job where, just like I had experienced in the Army, I knew I had made a difference. I had helped people, and that the next morning I would get up and I would want to go to work because what I was doing was something that I loved to do, so it really wasn't work. So I actually had the ability to participate in what Arizona State University's College of Law called the Truman Young Prosecution Fellowship, named after an Air Force Academy grad of all things, but it was still good. Go Army. My last year of law school, I worked as a prosecutor at the municipal, county, state, and federal levels, and I loved it. I saw in that work everything that I missed from being in the Army, and saw that I could make a difference in that regard. I worked in the office for about 4 years before I left for a few years, though I continued to be involved in criminal law and advocating for victims, working for the Arizona Voice for Crime Victims, and returned to the office in mid-08. My wife saw that I was not happy trying to do civil practice or doing anything else, and she relented and agreed that she would continue to fund my prosecution habit. So I went back to the office in mid-08. Our elected county attorney at the time resigned to run for attorney general, and I looked around the community and didn't see anybody that I would want to work for who I thought could bring the office out of the situation it was in. We had sort of a bad situation. My elected predecessor was ultimately disbarred. And when we settled all of the lawsuits among elected officials, it cost us $45 million. So I thought, what better environment to begin my elected prosecutorial career in, where I had nowhere to go but up. And I continue, so I was elected in a special election in 2010, re-elected in 2012, re-elected in 2016. And why do I keep doing it? Well, even with George Soros trying to spend $2 million to beat me, I continue to go back at it because I love the people I get to serve. And when you get to lead people like Rachel Mitchell, it makes the job very satisfying.
Yeah.
Well, thank you and good morning. So like Bill, I went to law school to be a prosecutor. I started life as a journalist, reporter for a small wire service in Chicago. I enjoyed it. It was fun covering cops and courts. I moved to DC to work in the Senate, and I continued to work as an editor and writer for various news outlets. But I learned early on, and it's in my blood too, because back in the day, my dad was the Cook County State's attorney, and I grew up listening to stories about him in court and cases and trials, and it was something that I became passionate about. So I went to night law school at American University, continued to work full-time as a reporter and editor, covered the U.S. Supreme Court in my final year at the Washington Times, called when I wanted to find a job as a prosecutor. I was living in Virginia. My husband's a Georgetown Law School grad, but he had no connections to Virginia prosecutors. And back in the day in Cook County, you would call someone and you'd say, hey, listen, I need to find a job. And you knew someone who knew someone, and someone would make a phone call, and you'd maybe get a job interview. But I happened to know a fellow who worked in the Commonwealth Attorney's Office in Arlington, who I used to work with when I was a reporter. And so I called him and said, hey, how did you get your job? He said, well, it turns out we have an opening. Some assistant had just tendered their resignation the day before. And I sent a resume, an old-fashioned typed-up resume, to then Helen Fahey, who was the Commonwealth's attorney in Arlington. And I started in the office June 1st of 1987 and have never looked back. It is the great professional experience and just being a minister of justice, what we do every day to echo Bill. There's nothing like it.
And I think this 2 days will be a nice opportunity for us to sort of revive and, the engines that we have to lead our offices and to continue to do the right thing. Because that's really all we get to do that. There's no other profession where you can go to work every morning knowing that you have to do the right thing. And I think being able to talk to other prosecutors and to have that collegiality and to continue to do the great work that we're doing. I'm here as a panelist and I'm delighted to be here. I'm not someone who thinks the criminal justice system is broken. I don't think anyone in this room thinks the criminal justice system is broken. And I hope we can have a great conversation over the next 2 days.
Mr. Bass?
Thanks, and thank you for inviting me, and Christine Hammond, thank you for inviting me. I worked many years with Christine at the Manhattan DA's office. I, like Theo, had law in my family. My father was a lawyer and also in public service, so in growing up, I saw as a child in the work that he did, that he loved what he did, and that it was meaningful for him, and that he was excited. He was excited about what he did. So clearly that was in my natural to affect me. But of course I didn't want anything to do like my father. So I went to work for an oil shipping company in West Africa, in and out of West Africa. And on and off for 5 years I worked out of the country, trying to be a businessman. But ultimately I figured out that if you are going to succeed in business on the west coast of Africa, you have to also bribe everybody. And that's just not a business model that I felt I would be successful at in the long term. And really, and as exciting as some of that was, it was ultimately not where I wanted to land. So I was fortunate enough to ask Bob Morgenthau, who was the Manhattan DA at that time, for a job. I think it's quite clear that if I looked at what I brought to the DA's office in 1982 compared to what students who come to us now bring to the DA's office, my candidacy would be a much lesser quality candidate than what we have today. But he gave me a shot, and I stayed in the DA's office and then went to the West Coast, where Dan Satterberg's from in Seattle. I started a firm in practice, white collar, and all kinds of trial practice in Seattle. And then ultimately, my experience in Manhattan had told me that if I ever had a chance to run for Manhattan DA, that would be, in my view, the best job I could have as a lawyer. And so my wife was dying to come home to New York City. We had some ill family members, and we came back to New York. And Bob, who had the job for 34 years, and a whole generation of lawyers wanted to run for DA, but Bob would never retire. And ultimately, I just happened to come back to New York at a cycle where Bob, really, who was going to be 90, he's now 99, he was 90 at that time, said, appeared he really might not run, and I ran for DA, and I won, and it still, to me, is what I felt it was when I was a first-year assistant trying misdemeanor cases in court, the most exciting, the most engaging job a police lawyer can have. And I'm doing it, as I think most all of us are, because I think we have a seat at the table, all of us, in one of the most exciting social developments in the country. And we, each of us, have the opportunity to see that close up and to have an impact on close up. We all care about fairness in the courtroom. We all care about keeping our community safe. And where we are able to sit and enact policies and make decisions that actually make those happen in our communities, I cannot think today of a better place to be in the country.
Thank you. Ms. Lathy, would you maybe share with us, how do you, in your view, has the role of the prosecutor changed over time? And what do you think are the challenges that in the role of the prosecutor that you see?
Well, the mission is always the same, which is to seek justice. But the role of the prosecutor has changed dramatically. At least I started in 1986 as an entry-level prosecutor, and I can recall back then possession of a couple of joints of marijuana, you got you 5 days in jail. I remember that. We had a cheat sheet that said that. And of course now in California it is legalized. But it has expanded tremendously, and I heard Gil talk about that. You can't just know about criminal law it's not enough to know about the penal code. You now need to know a little bit about health and welfare. You need to know about benefits. You must be engaged in some kind of crime prevention project in the community. For us, we chose juveniles 25 years ago to start an educational program. So we have about 250 people in our office who are actually teaching a curriculum called Project Lead for about 20 weeks in the schools. But you must, it seems to me our role has also changed in terms of we must be more data-driven. In other words, if the recidivism rates are high, you're sending people to jail and they're coming back out, and in 5 years, more than 70% of them are going back in, we're failing. And so you must be familiar with what are the root causes that cause people to choose to go into crime. Some people are evil, you write those people off. But as a prosecutor, you must be familiar with addiction and the role that plays into it. You must be familiar with terms like PTSD. You must be familiar with the challenges of women who may be traumatized by early sexual assault and then go on to spiral into a life of crime. You have to know that human trafficking is, back then we called it pimping and pandering and prostitution. You need to know what the terminology is and have a certain understanding. And you have to have a connection, be able to connect as a prosecutor to the community. I often feel that we are very, at least when I was in the prosecutors, we were very siloed. We hang out socially with other prosecutors and cops, and while that's fine, we do need to expand our horizons and find out what the average Joe and Josephina is thinking about crime. So crime prevention, root causes, data-driven. You must know, for instance, not just what your jury trial success rate is, but what is your recidivism rate? How are you doing? Are these long sentencings that you're asking for, are they really helpful? And are people coming out, do they have a choice at reforming? You must be familiar with reentry. You have to know, and I'll talk about it a little bit later, about mental health. You have to be able to discuss that in an intelligent factor and know who your behavioral health director is. And certainly you have to be knowledgeable about handling the media. That's crucial. Oftentimes people don't want to talk to the media, but you really can't hold this job unless you understand how it's your job. The public needs to know what you're doing. It's not your office. You work for the taxpayers, and oftentimes the media is the only way to communicate. So it's much more complicated.
Mr. McGann, what are you seeing in the Intermountain West there? How is their role changing as a prosecutor?
Thank you. And Jackie, I think you kind of covered a lot of what's going on in modern prosecution. But I think that it's been really interesting because I just ran in 2016, so it has been recent. And watching the public in response to an open district attorney seat in Denver was quite interesting, because in the past, I think people didn't really pay much attention. It was just one of those checkoffs on the ballot, and often people didn't even vote for a district attorney because they didn't know who it was, they didn't know much about it. And to this day, I still get confused with the Attorney General. I mean, people really, even with all the media coverage, don't necessarily understand what the DA does. But what was happening in Denver was reflective of what was happening nationally. The Black Lives Matter movement, the focus on officer-involved shootings. What are you as district attorney going to do about that? Are you going to have the courage to file a case against a police officer? What are you going to do about our communities of color? What are you going to do about mass incarceration? How is this impacting our young people? Those were the kinds of questions that I was getting. It wasn't about, how are you going to put the motor vehicle theft offender in prison? It was much broader than that. And I think we as prosecutors have got to respond and get ahead of some of this. We just had our District Attorney Council statewide conference Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday of this week, so I'm kind of fresh from that. But one of the things we were talking about is the whole bail bond issue. Nationally, there's discussion about elimination of cash bond, money bond, and it's just an interesting effort to try to get ahead of some of this, because in Colorado there is a lot of movement toward eliminating cash bond, and I think there's real merit to that, but what do we replace it with? So I think that we're seeing prosecutors now being involved in these much broader issues. You know, the legislature is looking at juvenile justice, they're looking at bail bonds, they're looking at our mandatory minimum sentences, as they should. And we as prosecutors, I think, need to join these efforts. There's a bit of a bunker mentality among prosecutors, I think, like we are in our silo, or we are in our, in Denver anyway, the offices tended to be somewhat insular. So we didn't go out in the community. We weren't talking to people about what we were doing, all the great things that we're doing as prosecutors. And it's similar throughout Colorado, I think. The prosecutors are feeling on the defensive, and we should, to some extent, but we should also be more proactive about all the great work that so many prosecutors are doing nationally and locally for diversion, for mental health, for behavioral health issues, getting people out of jail. So I think we have a little bit different role, and I welcome it. I think it's a good thing for the country, and I hope that we can all kind of work together to figure out how we project that more positive image of what we are doing and what we're about.
Bill, how about you? What is your experience, and how does that go with you?
Sure. Well, when I first became a prosecutor, my caseload was initially vehicular crimes, impaired drivers, drivers who hurt and killed people as a result of impairment. And my focus at that point in time was solely on just handling the cases that came across my desk, engaging with the families, sometimes surviving families, and working with law enforcement. But there wasn't much beyond that. When I returned to the office and ultimately supervised our auto theft bureau, I had a statewide auto theft task force to engage with. I had various community organizations that were advocates for one thing or another that contributed to wanting to address the overall rate of auto theft in the county. And that was one other thing too. My focus became not so much just dealing with the defendant in front of me in that particular offense. It also became much broader and encompassed prevention efforts, educating the community, and dealing with the offenses that came in front of us, as well as it began to be more, as what Jackie was mentioning too, trying to understand what are some of the crime drivers. And then when I became the county attorney back in 2010, we did start to see the wave of calls for reform. And it really required me then to step up and not just live within my role as a county attorney for prosecutors in court and do my own internal training and have those stereotypical outside of the office relationships. I had to start looking at needing to educate the community that I serve about what the prosecution function was and what our criminal justice system looked like within Arizona and within Maricopa County. We have our national narratives trying to bring people's focus back to what we were dealing with, which then necessarily required me to engage from prevention efforts to diversion and deferred prosecution efforts, all the way through being able to explain and articulate how our criminal justice system was operating to the legislature, to local media, to various community groups, to victim advocacy groups. So in many ways it was, I'm still doing the same basic function. I want to echo what Jackie said. Our job is still to seek justice, but we're now required to explain that, to educate, try to inspire people to learn more on their own and be savvy about it, and engage at all levels of the criminal justice system itself and throughout the entire community.
Yeah.
Well, my predecessor, Dick Trotta, ran and was reelected 4 times, and he always prided himself on making people think that it wasn't even an elected position because he didn't like to campaign, he never had an opponent, and he would kind of tell me when it was time for reelection time, shh. And it worked for him. It worked for him. It's not going to work for us. I think all of us who are incumbent electeds know that the next time we run, and I'm up next year, I ran in 2011 and was elected and re-elected in 2015. I run again next year, and I expect to have an opponent, and I know all of us who follow the work of the ACLU know that it's their mission to not have a sitting incumbent run unopposed. And you know, as much as they say there's 2 ways to run, unopposed and scared. So we're all going to probably be running scared from now on, and that's a good thing. I mean, we need to be able to make our case for re-election, why we should continue to lead the communities that we lead, and I'm gearing up for next year. And so we have to look at the job a little differently and talk about these issues that we're being made to talk about. And part of my theory on some of this is that we've gotten so much better at prosecution. When I started in '87, when Jackie started in '86, you know, I mean, my office was one of the first offices in the country to prosecute successfully a capital murder case using DNA evidence. So the advent of DNA in 1987 and that prosecution, we now have historical cell site information, jail phone calls where the defendant, you know, tells his mom to lie for him or his girlfriend to help with the alibi. We have those recordings. We have a treasure trove of text messages when we download phones. All these innovations have made us better at our prosecutions, made our convictions stick more. So the discussion is pivoted to who are the people doing the prosecutions. And I think that's where we find ourselves in the climate right now, and that's why we need to be out there. We need to be in our communities, and we need to be talking to, you know, all sorts of members, interest groups, to let them know what we're doing and why we're doing it, and how, at the end of the day, we need to remember that we are about, as Jackie says, and as Beth have said, and Bill, inside, it's about keeping our communities safe, and also giving voice to victims, because the one thing I don't hear enough about in this national discussion is about the victim. And I think we need to bring it back home to them, and I think that should be a continued mantra among our group.
Thanks. I think the role of a prosecutor changed over the time that I've been there. Focuses on attention on the ethics of prosecutors, and national attention focus on how we are doing our job and making correct decisions that are not affected by bias or other external factors in technology. So I was a defense lawyer for 20 years before I became DA. In 2009, when I ran, I went around the country talking to folks like Craig Watchin, who some of you may remember Craig. He was the Dallas County DA, and he'd open up something called the Conviction Integrity Program in Dallas. I think Santa Clara was here early on, did the same thing. But I was a defense lawyer, and as I was thinking about what I wanted to, what a major metropolitan city should have, it appeared to me that exactly we did need that. We did need a way to be transparent to the public about how we make decisions around race, how we monitor the ethical behavior of our assistants. And so I think that trend, and by the way, I give a lot of credit to the Innocence Movement. I think they showed us, they showed me that in ways I didn't appreciate, that people were going to jail who were not guilty. And I think that coming into prosecution as an elected DA in Manhattan in 2010, I saw this very much coming. And so we opened up a Conviction Integrity Program. And that has morphed into much more robust, where we are actually on a regular basis meeting as an office and looking at cases that are in the middle process where they fell apart, where we determined that the arresting officer got it wrong. So focusing on front-end training, focusing on reinvestigation, but focusing on today and what we are learning about this life from New York. This is what we're seeing. I used to think when I was a young prosecutor that the defensive, that all I needed to care about was Manhattan. That was my job, downtown, uptown. Today, our defensive perimeter is in Europe. It's in Singapore. This is where people are attacking us from. And so today, in our office, we have to think entirely differently about how we defend Manhattan from economic crime, particularly cybercrime.
Thank you. So there's a theme that's coming through here, which is the notion of community. So how do you communicate with your community? How are you assessing the needs of your community in your role as leaders in your respective offices?
Well, communication has been the biggest challenge for me. And that's because we have a media department, or had a media department that felt that we should not put out any press releases on any good news. They always felt that it should be when we file a murder case, then we put something out. When someone's convicted, but they really, the philosophy was good news won't be reported, it doesn't sell. So in 2012, when I came in, a lot of news reporters were being laid off. And I think one of the byproducts of that is the reporting, the quality of the reporting wasn't as good. You know, I mean, it wasn't as in depth. You could tell the reporters did not have a beat. They didn't know a lot about criminal justice. So we've done a couple things. We have decided that the media market is so much bigger than just the major newspapers. So we target bloggers, we target community papers, because we have a lot of people in a population of community people. A lot of people just read their local community papers. We targeted getting stories there. I stole a couple of ideas. I stole an idea from the DA of Florida, in Florida, Catherine Rundell Fernandez. So she puts out a newsletter. So we decided to do that. We've got a big database, we put out a newsletter, and the newsletter now is online and contains a video message, which is about 60 seconds of me just talking about what's going on in the office. We tweet a lot. We don't do Facebook, but we tweet a lot. We don't do Facebook because people can put negative comments on it. You can't erase them. But Twitter, it's a one-way communication thing. So we'll be tweeting in a few minutes about something like this. Recently I also took an idea from Dan Conley, who is the district attorney in Boston. He has a community panel. He chose some leaders, put together a community panel, and he brings them in about once a month and talks to them about what's going on in the DA's office. And the idea is they'll get out there and spread information about you. So the bottom line is you've got to do it a lot of different ways. I never felt comfortable, though, doing a press conference. I know people who, they create news in their office and they get it in the paper every single week. I just don't do that. I just feel that's goofy. You know, if you don't have anything to say, what are you out there for, kind of a thing. And, you know, you live by the media, you die by the media. You can't shut it down. You're out there every week, and then all of a sudden something bad happens, which is inevitable. And then you just say, no comment. Well, that looks goofy, too. So, you know, we're trying very hard to kind of spread the good news to whoever will listen.
But how are you interacting with your community, and what are the challenges you're seeing?
Yeah, so this is a really important issue for me. I talked about it in my campaign, that I would be more accessible. I believe in transparency, accountability, which are kind of the buzzwords right now. And so when I started, I did a number of things to try to do that. One is that I asked my deputy DAs to go to their neighborhood meetings. You know, neighborhood community groups meet usually once a month. And I have someone in my office that has a list of all of them and their contact info. And so she coordinates my deputies going out to neighborhood meetings, and even if it's not in their precise neighborhood, we try to hit all the major neighborhood groups in Denver at least once a year to have a presentation about what the district attorney's office is doing. And we have a handout that lists, in fact it might be in your materials, that lists kind of what we're doing in major areas. So that I think has been very helpful. It also gives the deputies a chance to hear what the community is asking and what they're concerned about. So it's a two-way street for us, and then they report back to me about what that neighborhood talked about. And then I also set up 3 community advisory panels. So I have one on police, law enforcement, community relations, one on immigration issues, and one on mental health, because those are areas that I think the community is very interested in. So We meet monthly. I meet with them. I chose people in the community that were active when I was campaigning, and I intentionally brought in those activists who are most vocal about issues to be part of my advisory council so that we could have this dialogue. And I think it's been very helpful. It has helped them learn about what I'm doing, and it has, I think, helped prevent some of the unrest or people who would be more likely to be critical of me, because I have representatives from those groups on these committees. That's not to say that there are not people out there that are critical, because, as Jackie pointed out, I think our communications and PR work is very different now with social media, so anyone can comment about anything pretty much. And we have an independent newspaper that is very active, that's online, and comments, they really focus quite a bit on criminal justice. So we get a lot of comments and articles in those online newspapers or newsletters. I agree with Jackie about getting your information out to community papers, because they are what people read often. And so the more, we send all of our press releases to all of our community papers as well as our national papers, and I make myself available pretty much any time a reporter asks for an interview. I will do it, whether it's by phone or in person. I just think it's important that they feel that they have access to the elected DA. I mean, we represent the people, we need to be available. So I've made a real effort to try to have more community involvement and learn more from the community, but also communicate more. We do Facebook, and yes, there are negative comments on there, but we do it, we do Twitter. Not as much as I'd like. I'm thinking we need to get, my poor PR guy is just working all the time, and I only have one for an office of, over 200 people. So I'm thinking we need to get one of those young interns that understands all this stuff like you were talking about, who can put together these things. And we're going to be starting a monthly newsletter. We're not doing that yet internally as well as externally. So, number of things to do.
How do you engage with community?
Sure, and part of it, I've got a challenge. My jurisdiction is pretty large, although I like coming to these events because then I get to look at Jackie and say, well, yours is bigger. I've got a county of over 4 million people. We're over 9,200 square miles, so trying to develop a sense of community and that kind of connection can be very challenging. Plus, I referenced earlier what happened to my elected predecessor. When I came into that office, our attorney-client relationship, I also have a civil function with my clients, was not very good, and we had a very negative impression among the entire community. So there were a number of things that I went after. I have resources to do it, but all these functions can be scaled. First, we engaged in social media. I shut down my Facebook page because I couldn't control what some people who never learned what it was to be civil or polite were putting on there. But we utilized Twitter. We utilize Nextdoor. Nextdoor is a communications app that can break down to specific neighborhoods, and so it allows you to target messages to specific areas to address community concerns there instead of broadly blanketing your entire community. We have a monthly newsletter as well. All emails that come into the office come to me, and I think I've been able to answer about 90% of all of those. I do regular press availability, but it is a challenge. Jackie makes a good point. You don't just want to stand up in front of a podium to say, okay, this is the bi-weekly opportunity for you to take your shots. You want to have something that you can actually share with the community. And good news does not get reported. Our local media sucks, which I call it like I see it, which is why I love, if it was an obscure reference earlier, Rachel Mitchell is my sex crimes division chief, special victims division, and she's working for the Senate Judiciary Committee this morning. But it forced our local media to have to talk about good work by a prosecutor. I know it killed them because they had to write about a prosecutor doing good things. And we do issue press releases, even if it's not going to get covered. I then catalog it on our website. And so there's a trail of breadcrumbs of good things happening. We post all of our press availability sessions on our own YouTube channel, which is great. Because when I get people who call in and they've seen something that's been misreported, I send them the video clip. And then the next email is, how could they get that so wrong? We also do a tremendous number of community events. Every day, there are prosecutors out in Maricopa County and people from our Community Affairs Bureau either teaching prevention for anti-bullying, to be self-aware to protect, for children protect themselves against abuse, or drug prevention. And during the high school football season, we go out to area high schools and we get kids to sign a pledge to be drug and alcohol free. In our 8th year, we've had over 50,000 kids sign that pledge. And we've heard from some that they get to tell someone no when they're first solicited for drug use because they've signed a pledge and their parents are going to make them abide by it. We utilize the Citizens Academy to create advocates out in the community. We run citizen safety forums that give us a chance to provide information on what's going on and what people can do to avoid victimization. I'll go out. If I get invited to a community meeting event, I don't care if it's a block watch, Rotary, whatever, I go. And then I have a business advisory council and a community advisory council. We have an open door for community members. I will meet with anyone, even if there are groups that you would think have a traditional opposition to the prosecution function. There are only 2 people I refuse to meet with, and it's because they are more interested in controversy than solutions. And I've made it abundantly clear that I will meet with members from their groups, but I will not meet with them. As long as I keep that to one hand, that's a good thing. And then the last thing, Sim, I reorganized the general trial groups within my office to focus on specific areas within Maricopa County. So I have 8 community-based prosecution bureaus, teams of prosecutors who work in the same part of the community day in and day out, same neighborhoods, same community and business leaders, same law enforcement agencies. We started that in October of last year after piloting a smaller version of it, and that's paying dividends.
Thank you. Theo, what about in your jurisdiction?
Well, I'm the outlier up here because I'm wedged in between Fairfax County and Washington, D.C. I'm just across the river from Washington, D.C. And Arlington County is the smallest geographic county in the country. It's just under 24 square miles. We're 220,000 people. And I have the City of Falls Church, which is 2.2 square miles, and another 10,000 people. So, you know, I engage with my community in the grocery store and the dry cleaners. You know, I had 2 kids who played high school sports, and I was on the PTA, and I was involved in my community and my church. So that's in part how I communicate. And also, people still, my direct dial is out there for anyone to see, and I get phone calls and I answer, "This is Theo," and like, "Oh, it's you." I'm like, "Yeah, you called my number." And so, and it'll be a community member asking about a particular disposition or something that's happening that they've read about in the paper, or if there's a particular crime spree involving indecent exposure or sexual assaults on our bike path. So I'm really on the ground in my community, but having said that, we have started to do more. You're looking at the PR department, it's me. And being a former reporter does help because I can draft a press release, but I have to tell you, unlike some of my colleagues from Virginia, raise your hand, Virginia, there's a lot of us here. You know, the Washington Post and the local papers don't care about us. I could probably hold a press conference saying that I don't give the best news in the world, and I wouldn't have any takers. And so in some respects, I'm happy for that. But some of my colleagues in the Tidewater area and other areas of the state, they're constantly being FOIA'd, you know, they're constantly being questioned, and so it's a different atmosphere in some parts of Virginia. But again, you know, we're doing things like a Attorneys Academy, which we're going to start next year, going to shop talk in our African American community, the barbershop, which has been a really interesting experience for me, and I've engaged with the re-entering citizens, and that's been a really good thing and a powerful thing. My assistants, all 15 of them, will go out to community groups. We do a lot with training with our police department. We do a lot with our middle schools and our high schools. But again, I'm a small fish in a much bigger pond here. So my hat's off to my colleagues up here who really have it tough in having to do the PR thing in a way that's on steroids.
Would you say though, because you are personally accessible, you have a very different relationship with the community of citizens?
I I think that that's true. I mean, you know, as I said, I have to be very careful when I'm engaged, when I'm walking down the street, and if someone tries to, or if I'm driving, someone's going to cut me off, not to flip the bird, because it's like, I just saw the comic book attorney, and she's a bird. So that's how we are on the ground in Arlington.
So I have obviously very different restrictions.
I have the same phenomenon, people flipping me the bird all the time. So New York City, Manhattan, is a massive media center. And New York County just seems to be a magnet for people of wealth coming to misbehave in Manhattan. So we have a huge tabloid community as well as more serious news outlets. And so a large part of our media work is unfortunately defensive, and that is answering to dozens and dozens of requests for information on ongoing cases in trials all around the courthouse. So we have to have the ability for us to have good relationship with the in-courthouse reporters, getting them what they need in order to write their stories and trying to also help shape those stories. We have a professional group of communication professionals, about 6, and they are extremely helpful and use many of the techniques that my colleagues here use. What I would say just, and I'm sure this is done by my colleagues also, but we communicate, or I try to make sure that in our work we are communicating with the communities in sort of the functions and the way the office is built up. In 2010 we started something called Crime Strategies Unit. And the idea was to have an intelligence unit within the DA's office that didn't rely on the police to help us identify who was driving crime in every neighborhood and enable us to create strategies to dismantle those gangs, focusing on, at the time, on guns and gangs. But for each geographical location that was a crime strategy zone, typically grouped in 3 precincts, the lawyer in our office who was responsible, not to try cases, but to understand block by block, building by building, what was going on in that section. They are 24/7 on the phone with the police in the communities. And so we became essentially, I don't know, it seems to me not be the right word, but when the commanding officer of the 19 precincts has a question about a case, he no longer has to figure out who, where do I find someone to talk to about this case. We have a very senior person who is always available for that location to handle questions from the field. And that also applies to the communities. We have business counsel in each of these 5 locations or zones in Manhattan, and this crime strategies lawyer goes and participates in all those meetings as well. So the work of the crime strategies unit, which is really about knowing granularly Manhattan, is very much engaged with talking to the community, talking to the police as our partners and other law enforcement. And then we have a very robust community affairs unit. Others have that as well. They're sort of mapped on the map as the same groupings as the crime strategies unit, but these are non-lawyers whose job it is also in that zone for which they're responsible to basically attend every community meeting, to be eyes and ears for information coming in and out to us in the office and to the community. But I never felt I was a particularly great communicator, so I think for me this has been a challenge because it's never been my first instinct to pick up the phone and talk to a reporter. My predecessor, Bob Mooring, though, was a master at communication, and he was there 34 years, and he really was very, very sophisticated. I don't have that sophistication, and so I've had to manage communicating without, in a different way, in a different time. It is just much, much more hostile today than it was even 9 years ago when I took the job. It is just, people are angry, and people are angry at people in power, and you know why that is. I mean, we look around what's going on in the country, and people don't understand why things are happening the way they're happening. Either way, whichever side you're on, it's just anger, and that anger requires us, I think, in New ensure in the other jurisdictions here to have to be stronger in our communication and more transparent.
So we have communication with the community that also implies a certain expectation of the community. So how have you delivered on an accomplishment that you're proud of as a response to that, or are you working on as a response that an accomplishment or a project? Stacey?
Well, when I was running, I had just finished a really challenging episode in my life where someone very close to me had a mental illness, and they were having a crisis. And I remember thinking that that this could end up poorly, that my loved one could end up dead some way or arrested. And that whole journey really opened my eyes, as well as a particular case of a college girl who was arrested, who was suffering from mental illness. And I promised myself that, you know, I promised God that if you let me in, you let me have this job, I am going to focus on reforming how the criminal justice system responds to people who are in a mental health crisis. So, you know, I get in, and less than a year into my first year, the sheriff's department personnel come to me and said, there are people in the jail who just simply don't belong here, Jackie, and we need somebody to convene a group to start figuring out alternatives. Our behavioral health program in our county was woefully inadequate. They weren't doing their job, and that whole population of people who probably used to get treatment in mental health facilities had shifted to the streets, and then also had shifted into the jail. And so I convened a group. It was a small group at first, and the group grew to over 100 people from different disciplines to really focus in on what could we do to develop alternatives, to develop training for law enforcement so that when they encounter someone with a mental illness, they could de-escalate. What could we do to start creating treatment plans and options to send people? Because I, as a prosecutor, wake up all the time looking at the papers thinking, oh my God, I hope we didn't go soft on someone in the past, and here they come out and commit the next horrible crime. So we convened a group, and we have published a plan called the Blueprint for Change. We have gotten our county to dedicate $120 million to this issue, as well as we've gotten state funds. And you know, since we started, we have taken out about roughly 3,000 people who would have been headed to prison or jail, and finally gotten them well and gotten them plugged into treatment services. Many of them need housing, and we discovered when we solved that housing, supportive housing issue, but there's still so much to do. It's a project that I'm most proud of, but I really think it's going to take a decade to right the wrongs that we have created. So I'm most proud of that, and I'm most proud of that because the people who are, the families who are suffering, and there are a lot of them, don't have a lot of political clout. They don't. They don't have a lot of help. And this is a project where I think it's going to pay off to the community well, but you know, this is not something where you, as a prosecutor, willingly want to get involved in, but the momentum of this particular movement is amazing. I knew I was on the right track when all of these people started showing up at the meeting. We started getting phone calls and emails and resources coming our way. So this is the most rewarding, and I feel like if it can be done in LA County, where we're so large and so dysfunctional and so many departments, that could be done and transferred throughout the nation.
Thank you. Ms. McCann, what's the project or accomplishment response to?
Thank you. Well, I guess I have sort of a similar feeling of accomplishment about sort of that pre-trial or when people are first contacting our system, my office was not appearing at first advisements under my predecessor. So bonds were getting set, decisions were being made with the public defender there, but the district attorney wasn't present. So I changed that right away, and we now are there 24/7. So we're there on the weekends for first advisement. But part of that has also been that my attorneys now sit down with the public defender ahead of when the judge comes out and does bond setting and first advisement, so that they go through the cases and pretty much agree on a lot of the individuals, so that we are seeing more people getting out on personal recognizance bonds. We're seeing more efforts in our pretrial services. So our population in the city jail has decreased, but we are also working with our pretrial services, the public defender's office, as well as our judges, to look at what we're calling a fast-track drug program to identify people earlier who are drug addicted, and rather than just let them out on a PR bond or keep them in jail with no treatment, we're working to provide some mechanism to get them into a treatment option. They may be out on bond, but part of the bond requirement will be that treatment. And we've also started medically assisted treatment, which I think you mentioned earlier. Matt, you'll probably hear about that if you haven't, for people who are withdrawing from opioids, to assist them in that withdrawal. And we're connected in with our Denver Health, which is our public health system, who staffs our jail, so that those records are now in the Denver Health system. When people get out, they are referred for continued use of Suboxone or whatever the drug is that they are on. And so it's kind of a coming together of not just the DA, but partners, the city attorney, the county courts, our pretrial services, our probation department, to really try to do something that's more effective with people with drug addiction and mental health. And along those lines, the other thing that I'm very proud of is we've started a pre-file, a young adult diversion program, which we've never done in Denver. We've never done pre-file diversion, and we've never had a diversion program for young adults. We've had a very good juvenile diversion. But now we are starting this young adult diversion, and doing pre-file took some work. You know, detectives are used to having their case accepted or refused, and now we're asking them to hold them in abeyance while we do this diversion with young adults. And we're also starting restorative justice in that context, which I think is very exciting. So, some of this.
Well, how about you? You've got a great jurisdiction, 4 million people, unique challenges. What are you proud of?
I kind of alluded to it in some of my earlier comments about wanting to take a look at cases and deal with broader impacts on the community and focus on getting the best resolution in them. And in order to do that, we came up with a community-based prosecution model. We also stole Cy's criminal strategies unit and adapted it to enhance not just the relationships with communities in each of those bureaus, but also data sharing and data analysis too, to better impact crime in each of those areas. And we're starting to see the results of that. It's also allowed us to identify potential defendants who shouldn't go into the criminal justice system and focus our resources on those who absolutely need to go to prison. We've had instances in which we were able to, with an initial contact with our office, review the case, have that particular individual's social media history, entire criminal history to include arrests reviewed, and identified that all this person's prior misdemeanor arrests were for public disorder offenses. And lo and behold, it looked like they were someone who was suffering from mental illness, and that's exactly what it was. And we were able to divert them out of the criminal justice system and treatment. And then on the other end, in getting ready to offer a disposition in a case where initially we were going to offer, I think, 4 or 5 years, did a complete review with the arresting agency to find out what that person's impact was in the community, reviewed their entire social media history, their criminal history out of state, and they did not get that 4 to 5 years. And we were able to convince a judge to sentence them to a significantly harsher prison term. So I would say that the accomplishment there is having a better understanding of the impact of crime in the community and a particular defendant's profile and identifying where they really need to be dealt with in the criminal justice system.
So right after I got elected, I instituted the drug court in Arlington. My predecessor, I loved him to death, but he was resistant to it, and that was one of the first things that I did. And we're very proud of it. And of course, in Virginia, you can only begin a drug court with the acquiescence of the Commonwealth's attorney, so I was really happy to bring that on board for my community, and it's been a really great success. We've worked really hard on pretrial diversion, and a bond diversion program, a forensic team that we put together, the different, I'll use the word, stakeholders, and can come together to, set up a program so that low-level offenders who do have mental health issues are diverted from jail to, a program with our Community Services Board where they get wraparound services. They are, made to take their medication, make sure they know their court dates are. And interestingly, we're meeting resistance from our public defender because obviously they're still in the criminal justice system, and some of these missteps while on pretrial diversion could cause them to come back before the court. So we need to, they're not as willing to engage as I think they should to benefit their clients because they see that some of these missteps may bring these individuals back to court and then have to go into incarceration to await a determination of their guilt or innocence. I'm proud of the lobbying efforts that I do personally on behalf of our Commonwealth Attorneys Association in Virginia. This may come as a surprise to folks, but just until recently, the felony threshold between misdemeanor and felony larceny was only $200. So we as an association, got behind an increase. I personally lobbied for an increase for a number of years with my legislative delegation because I thought it was way too low. We did get it raised to now $500. But before that, in my own exercise of prosecutorial discretion, I raised the threshold in my office to $500, and even then, we've come up with creative dispositions to prevent that first felony conviction, which we all know is just so difficult for people to be able to get beyond that once that happens. So I go to court every day. So I'm on the ground in court, and I don't have my own caseload, but I do our pleas, our dispositions, I argue bond motions. And just the other day, there was a guy who got picked up on a bench warrant. If it had taken the natural course, he was arraigned. He would have had to get his public. And he had been out on for many years on the run, but it was a restitution issue, and he comes into court from the lockup, and I've got the file, I don't have a criminal history, and right then and there I say to the court, let me run the record, and his wife was there, the guy had a job, he got picked up because on our old bench warrant because he was working and didn't have the right permit, and they ran him and they found out he had this felony arrest and a warrant in Virginia. The point is, I made the determination right there, hey, we PR'd him, got him out, got the PD involved. So we're on the ground every day doing the right thing. And I hope by example in my office to make sure that our folks every day in court are making those adjustments and attention to the kind of details that end up with this guy getting out and only the right people being convicted and sent away, as Bill says, deservedly for a long time. The others working with them to avoid that first felony conviction or that first, taste of incarceration.
So I know you have a variety of different innovative programs, and so maybe nothing to choose would be like who's your favorite child, but if you had to choose one accomplishment in response to what would that?
I'd have two.
Okay, all right.
One, we are blessed because of our investigative work in white-collar cases and being located in New York City to obtain fines and settlements which are large numbers that are statutory authorized, but those numbers enable us to make criminal justice investments that most offices can't make. One of the things I'm most proud of is that we invested $38 million in creating a nationwide program, an RFP for jurisdictions who had untested backlog and rape kits to get funding to test those rape kits. And that now is coming to a close. The data is astonishing. About 50% of the kits that were tested, which had biological material, ended up matching someone in the criminal justice system. and half that group matched someone who had prior sexual convictions. So just by focusing on helping to solve the untested rape kit backlog, we were able, in our part of the jurisdiction, to do something that I think was really important
If I
in
may
criminal
interrupt
justice.
just for a second, I want to thank you because we just filed 15 of those that were untested, that we converted. So that is having an impact nationally and locally as well. So thank you.
Great.
So we got one of those grants. We received one of those grants in my office from SI, and we wound up being able to test 1,000 more kids than what we thought. And we found the same, very similar results to what SI just mentioned. We've got 8 indictments of it.
Unfortunately, the idea was not mine, but I have some very smart people in my office who came to me and said, this is something that we need to do because we should. And the second is, I think it follows what others have said here, but I think it is just how we as an office have rethought the intersection between our work and race. When I was running for DA, stop and frisk, which I think most of you may have read about in the paper, was a high issue, and the NYPD was being criticized that its stop and frisk practices were just straight out unlawful. And when I ran for DA, I said, I really need to get a handle in my own office about whether there is racial disparity in our offices handling cases. Because one thing to criticize Ray Kelly, but it's another thing when I'm the DA. So one of the things that I'm very glad we did is in 2010, we brought in an outside consultant, the Vera Group. Many of you have heard of it. They're a well-known consulting group in criminal justice. And they did a racial disparity review of our office practices, bail, plea bargaining, sentence recommendations, and the like. They looked at about 2 years of data, hundreds of thousands of cases, and they issued a report, which we made public, indicating where we did have disparity in our functioning. But the bigger question that revealed to me was that we have such a big justice system in New York. We are bringing in tens and thousands of cases, and almost 86 to 90% of those are men and women of color. And so what we had was a system that was bringing in 100,000 cases a year, most of which were low-level cases, marijuana or minor cases, minor misdemeanors, minor drugs. And so our goal was to see if we could right-size the justice system. And using many of the things that my colleagues here have used in their offices to try to bring down, without sacrificing public safety, by a large number those individuals who otherwise would be prosecuted by our office. And since 2012, we've reduced the number of misdemeanor violation prosecutions that we would have brought to your office from about 90,000 to about 50,000. And next year, when we add the decision that we are not going to be prosecuting marijuana possession, that's the 5,000 cases, and 10,000 cases we're not prosecuting theft of services, which is what we call fair beating, when you jump over a turnstile. Now, there's a lot of uproar that what we were going to be doing was essentially going to send to New York to a handbasket, and that's the broken windows theory. But my view is that we aren't the New York 1980. We are a very different city. Violent crime has gone down astonishingly, as we mentioned yesterday. And so I think we have an opportunity to essentially create a peace dividend, taking advantage of what we've learned through science in terms of diversion, or relationships with the communities. And I'm knocking on wood, but this has been a trend since we started this reduction, this significant reduction of bringing in cases, diverting them, finding other ways to do with the mouth system, is that crime continues to go down. And so I think those who feel that if you don't arrest people smoking marijuana, if you don't arrest people who jump over the turnstile, you are essentially seeding the outer barrier, and then the hordes will come in, and you'll be overrun, and New York will go back to the 1980s. New York's just not going to let that happen. And so by reducing our incoming cases by that volume, I think we are changing the trajectory for that 50,000 people who are not coming into the system, 85% of whom would be black and brown, their future is going to be, I think, affected more positively by not having those cases come in and processed as criminal cases with perhaps criminal adjudications, but other ways to have a consequence. But I'm not sure that the consequence for smoking marijuana should be handcuffs, or the consequence for jumping the turnstile should be handcuffs, when you can drive down the West Side Highway at 85 miles an hour, much more dangerous, and you get a ticket.
Thank you. We're sort of winding down, but if I may ask you to maybe limit your answer to maybe a minute, but I do want to ask, as you face the 21st century and we look at sort of the climate, the social climate, the political climate, the lack of services and challenges, resources, what do you see as the challenges that you are thinking are going to be confronting as you have to deal? What are the challenges for those in office? Ms. Lacey?
Well, the way I see it, in the criminal justice reform movement, no one is really talking about the racial demographics of the victims of violent crimes. Nobody out there, you can't find reports. You can find a lot of reports that create a very slanted picture that prosecutors, like the diverse group that is sitting up here, is equivalent to the man. Just putting people of color away, ruining lives. And we've got to regenerate that spirit of pride that caused each of us to leave maybe a more lucrative lifestyle and dedicate our lives to making sure that our communities are safe. And so we will be under attack for not being progressive, but I think it's up to the modern prosecutor to fight back and say, hold up a minute. What about the underserved communities that are now enjoying a lower rate of crime than ever? They're able to be out in public parks and places. And what about them? And don't we owe everybody in this country, the freedom to live in a crime-free environment? And I think that's going to be the test. And really, I'm just paraphrasing what I heard from Darcel, who's the DA of the Bronx. We got to fight back and own it today, and not be very apologetic about holding people accountable for the personal choices they made to victimize others for their benefit.
So one of the challenges that I really struggle with in my office is the whole juvenile arena, because I do believe that adolescent brains are not fully developed, and you know, the areas that control impulse and judgment are the ones that are not fully developed. And it kind of ties in a little bit about what Jackie was talking about, because we're seeing in some communities 14, 15-year-olds carrying guns to a much higher level than we have seen before. And they're not just carrying them, they're using them. So I really struggle with what is the appropriate thing to do with a 14-year-old who shoots and either kills someone or permanently maims that child for life. And we have a couple cases like this going on right now, so that's part of why I'm talking about it. But I think figuring out how do we address this, this need that juveniles have to carry guns and to feel like they have to for protection. We're looking at maybe a juvenile gun court. I know Dan in Seattle has done something along these lines with diversion for kids that are carrying guns, but it's the violence in these neighborhoods. So you end up with one family with a young generally man, in prison the rest of his life, possibly, and another family with a maimed or dead child. So I think this is one of my biggest challenges.
So I'm going to touch on two, one internally in the office and one specifically for me and externally. Internally, I think our biggest challenge is capturing all the data that we have available so that we can have as clear a picture as possible about what we're dealing with in the community so that we can respond appropriately and educate the public about what's going on within our jurisdiction and being able to detach from the very generalized national narrative and help people understand where we need their partnership, whether it's a relationship between communities being policed and the police officers serving that community, up to being able to try to prevent crime in the first place and letting people know exactly what's going on. The second thing is what I've seen as a very disturbing trend since the 2016 cycle, and that's the politicization of the prosecution function. I don't believe that there's such a thing as progressive justice or conservative justice. There's no such thing as Republican justice or Democrat justice. I'm sure that if we want to go around the room and identify areas where we have a difference of opinion in something, we can do that. We could waste all that time. But I venture to say that when it comes to criminal justice issues, that there isn't much daylight between any of us, regardless of whether you have a particular party affiliation or run in a partisan election. And so one of my challenges is to continue to work in my community and with the media to get them to understand that these other political narratives that overshadow just about everything else that goes on in government really has no place in what we do. I have never read a police report where I saw a criminal check somebody's voter registration before they victimized them. It just hasn't happened. So wanting to continue to ensure that the public understands the neutral aspect of our job when it comes to the political part of it, and that we serve our entire community.
Thea?
Well, very quickly, I'm going to echo everything that my colleagues up here have said. I think the challenge that we have as the leaders of our offices, and it's easier for me because I have a small office, and I can only imagine how daunting it is for the folks up here with much larger offices and those of you out in the out here in front of us. But the people that we hire to be our prosecutors, I think that's a huge challenge, to make sure that we are hiring dedicated, smart folks with perseverance, integrity, and above all, humility. I think that's really important. We all know how powerful our jobs are. And you can, look at a young person right out of college, a law school, and, they want to make their mark as an assistant DA and then, check that box off. I think we have to be careful who we're bringing into our offices to go into our courtrooms every day and to represent our communities, because it's such an important job. And, for the big offices, it is a challenge. For small offices like mine, I can walk into my courtrooms and watch my people work and sit in the back and listen to their bond arguments or their closing arguments or their sentencing arguments and make an assessment. But I think that's really huge, to make sure we're hiring the right people to do this really important work.
Biggest pleasure I've had is one that I didn't predict when I ran for DA. Is I think the community district attorneys around the country are amazing, and that we really, as Bill said, we do not. If Congress could learn from coming to a conference where district attorneys of both parties spent no time talking about the politics, but the policy, and I think we do that amazingly well for folks who are elected. But the biggest challenge for me, among the many challenges that are out there that are made, is cybercrime. I simply don't think we have a clue on how to deal with cybercrime at the national level, speaking across sectors and even speaking across borders. This is just going to roll us, and that's where I think we need national leadership. National leadership, we need leadership by folks like us who are very much on the front lines of cybercrime, affecting every member of our community.
Well, this is bringing our conversation to close for the first session, and I'd just like to take a second to say that as we start going into the remainder of the 2 days, that if you, as you listen to the range and diversity of experiences, jurisdictions, I think you'll see that there are common themes, there are common concerns, and there's incredible innovation and creativity which is going outside the traditional role of what we think of a prosecution. So please join me in giving them a round of applause, which will show them.